Question, what is a dynasty? And then after you answer that to yourself, answer me this. Is Georgia a dynasty? Do they have one right now? I heard that word being thrown around pretty flippantly this week. It's not flippant. I guess people thought it through. I just question what a dynasty is. And I look at what's happening at Georgia right now. There's no one in the world more impressed by this than myself. However, the word dynasty did not immediately come to my mind when we were doing post-game coverage there on the field in Inglewood. Yeah, that's where we were, Monday night. I think it's an extremely dominant stretch. I've always thought of the word dynasty apparently a little bit different than other people do. So I felt it necessary, because I keep having this thrown at me, to dive into this for just a second tonight. I am not there is the reason. And I think I'm in the minority. I think I am. We're going to find out if I am as the show goes on and the comment section proliferates. Here's the way I've always thought about this. If everything were to stop for you today, so let's say Georgia never even makes a bowl game again and they fire Kirby 3 years from now, extremely likely, obviously. But let's say it would just all come crashing to a halt. And this was the end of his success at Georgia. If we fast forward 20 years from now, would you look back and talk about a Georgia dynasty? Or would you look back and say they won a couple of titles in the early 2020s and that's how you talk about Georgia? Because I think the latter is true. I don't think it's the former. I think if it were to all stop now, it's a great run, but that's what I think people would look at it as. A run that got capped in the latter stages with a couple of championships. I don't think they would call it a dynasty. So anyway, I'm not saying they're not well on their way to one. That's where my mind is. I don't think that they're in dynasty territory yet, only because it should be extremely rare, or rarefied air, I guess. And I asked Jesse, hey, what do you think a dynasty is when you're putting your graphics package together today? What do you think? Well, we've had several teams win back-to-back championships. If you're not watching on YouTube, you just saw a list of them. So several programs have won back-to-back titles. I don't think that we would have looked up and down that list and said, all right, every one of those is a dynasty. So then obviously it takes more than just winning back-to-back titles, which is already in and of itself extremely difficult. Then what do we need? You would probably argue, well, even if you're winning back-to-back titles, it also needs to be contained within an extended run of success. Now that they've had. That they have had. And if that's your only definition, an extended run of pretty good success and then winning a couple of titles, which is fair, then I would get it. By the way, Jesse, do we have those two tweets? You're looking at Kirby. You're looking at what he's done right now. Since 2017, with the exception of the COVID year, which is thrown out for obvious reasons, it's a double-digit win or better season every year. The one thing that had been sort of the albatross around their ankle, so to speak, was, well, they're 0-4 against Nick Saban. Well, then they beat Alabama in the title game last year. They didn't play them this year. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. So we had a couple, well, actually we had several hundred tweets in response to this today, but I wanted to show a couple of them. These were some of your takes. Bobby said, dynasty equals 3 national championships in a 5-year span. I don't necessarily think I would make it that lofty. And I'm sitting here telling you, I think it needs to be really lofty because USC didn't do that. And when I think of USC briefly, I think of a little, maybe a mini dynasty, somewhere between an impressive run and a dynasty. They didn't do that. The whole 3 championships thing, I don't think you need to, at least in my mind, hit a certain number of championships like the College Football Hall of Fame. You got to be a 60% winner if you're a head coach. I'm not quite there. Another one here. A period of sustained success that spans more than one iteration of a core team. That is an interesting concept. That means basically you can't just have one complete all-star squad that you recruit and you develop and then they win you multiple titles, but outside of that you never really did anything, because that's a great team, but that's not a dynasty. That was an interesting way to phrase that. Here's the interesting part. There was not a core group that just did this for Georgia. You're hearing a lot about Stetson Bennett because he was the starting quarterback eventually on these last 2 teams, the 2 teams that won championships. And if that's the way you remember these teams, that's totally fair and that's understandable. But I remember April. I remember the NFL draft. I remember 15 guys leaving last year's team that didn't play a down this year. So core group. I mean, where do we draw the line? Are there a certain number of players you have to retain from one team to another team? So as you can see, this is very subjective. It's very arbitrary. Here's where my head's at on this. it really comes down to how I remember you, which is kind of unfair, you know, because Georgia's accomplished what many would say already in this last few year stretch what USC under Pete Carroll accomplished. And in some ways, I understand that. 2 championships to 2 championships, several really, really good seasons. You go back to that USC run. Now, granted, that's in my sort of childhood, adolescence, middle school, high school era. So I'm watching that, and it's having a very, very big impact on me. So obviously, I romanticize the USC teams, and I remember them a little bit differently. But they had 7 straight 11-plus win seasons under Pete Carroll at one point. They had 4 Rose Bowl wins, 2 Orange Bowl wins. They had 2 national championships. They played that classic game against Texas in '05 where it's coin flip. And that's the way that game came down. Oh, I miss Keith Jackson so much. But that's the way that game ended. And I remember that as a dynasty. Well, they didn't win 3 titles. Am I supposed to exclude them because of that? I don't know. I remember them as a dynasty. I remember Miami as a dynasty. So there was this other school of thought out there that you have to have a sustained run and you can't have any down year. You can't have a dud season in there. Well, here's the thing with Miami. In the 83 to 91 time frame, they had 3 different coaches. You're on the tail end of Snellenberger, then you have Jimmy Johnson come in, and then you have Dennis Erickson come in. And Jesse, I think we were looking earlier today, the first year under Jimmy Johnson, I think they were like an 8-win team, which is not dynasty material. I then made the executive decision, at least on our little grease board in the office, we're going to allow you to have 1 down season, especially if you're transitioning coaches, and you're not transitioning most of the time because they're being fired. Like Jimmy Johnson, he goes on to the NFL. It's not because he flamed out or anything like that. So I don't know. Obviously subjective. But Georgia, if they're not there, well on their way, I asked producer Jesse, obviously, do you think they're in dynasty mode yet? He said, I don't think they're quite there yet, but they're close. And I asked Jesse, how do you know when they're going to be there? And he said, actually, I got up and I went and got something to drink. And when I came back in, he had those wide saucer eyes that producer Jesse only has when he has come up with a really good metaphor. The fuel on which this show operates, in other words. And he said, you know what Georgia is? Georgia is the bank robber. Follow me here. Georgia is the bank robber who made it past security. They got in the bank. They successfully subdued everyone. They got to the register. They had the teller open it up. Didn't have to get violent. Actually, Georgia got extremely violent Monday night, but you get where I'm going with this. They got all the cash in a sack. They're on their way out, but there's one final layer of security because you know good and well that guy at the front door is called reinforcements. They got to get past that last line. Jesse says they're almost there. Jesse says they're very close. They can see it. They can see the light on the other side of the door. And so I said, that's wonderful, Jesse. You got to land it for me, okay? You got the wings on the metaphor. Where's the landing gear? He said, well, they got to beat Nick Saban again. That's what they have to do. They were 0-4 against him. Now they're 1-4. And a Detroit Lions fan being the case, he said, if they don't lose J-Mo last year, Georgia doesn't beat Alabama. His words, not mine. So at him, don't at me. And I said, that's fair. That's fair. Because you know, Jesse's of the Rick Flair school of thought. To be the man, you got to beat the man. I guess multiple times. So Georgia teetering on the precipice of dynasty territory. If they win next year, if they win a 3rd straight, well, really even now it doesn't matter, but then especially it wouldn't matter regardless of what people say. So I will be more than a bit interested to see what the comments section says about this. Guys, thanks for watching Late Kick. Make sure to leave a comment. I love interacting with you. But most of all, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. That's how we keep all of this free.